Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 346. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. A lot to talk about on today's show, so I want to get into it right after I get through a couple of plugs here. I want to ask people to share the show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute, where I'm the news editor, and you can find myself and co-host of the show, Will Porter and Connor Freeman, writing in the news section of the Libertarian Institute through most of the week. You can also find my writing at antiwar.com, where I'm the opinion editor. The show goes on the blog at antiwar.com. You can find the video version of the show at YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee. And if you are listening from one of those platforms, please click the subscribe button. And if you're on YouTube, you also got to hit that notification bell, or else YouTube's never going to tell you when there's a new episode of the show out. It's up everywhere you could listen to podcasts. It's also on the Libertarian Institute all podcast feed, along with the Sky Horton Show, Vital Descent, and other great podcasts. And you can support the show just by doing your CBD shopping with our sponsor, Paloma Verde, PalomaVerdeCBD.com. The promo code is PEACE. They have high-quality CBD products at Paloma Verde. The more I talk to people and mention the sponsor of the show is a CBD company, tons of people tell, oh, I love CBD. I use CBD for this and that. And so if you do, you want to support the show, check out the products at Paloma Verde. I'm pretty sure they're going to have what you like. They have all kinds of different CBD. They even have some full spectrum products. So if you want to get a little THC too, that's definitely available for you and legal through Paloma Verde. They ship it to you from anywhere in the country. They got all their legal ends worked out with that, so that's absolutely fantastic. And you get high quality CBD products in the mail. PalomaVerdeCBD.com. The promo code is PEACE. You're going to save 20%, so the products are a very good price. And the show is going to get a kickback on that. So help out yourself, help out the show. Again, the promo code is PEACE. All right, let's get into it. First article today from Dave DeCamp, November 3rd at antiwar.com. Ukraine Parliament approves 2023 victory budget with $38 billion deficit. Ukraine's parliament on Thursday overwhelmingly passed a draft victory budget for 2023 that includes a record $38 billion deficit that Kiev is expecting its Western backers to cover. Do everything to bring victory closer. It was with this philosophy that we drafted this budget, Ukrainian Prime Minister said after the vote. According to Reuters, the budget was passed with 295 lawmakers voting in favor, none opposed, and only 35 abstaining. The Prime Minister added the budget includes about $27 billion for the military and security spending. To put that in perspective, the Pentagon says the U.S. has pledged about $17.9 billion in arms for Ukraine since February 24th invasion. According to the German-based Kael Institute, the U.S. military aid for Ukraine since February 24th, or I guess it is January 24th in there, about $27 billion. And so, the Ukraine has that as a part of their budget. Now, with this massive deficit in the budget, I think there's going to be this really kind of funky math that goes on within the White House where they're going to be able to provide Kiev with direct budgetary assistance. And Kiev is going to give that money to their military, and their military is going to use that to buy weapons. But I don't think that the White House is going, or in the Pentagon certainly, won't count that as actually giving military assistance to Kiev. So I just wanted to bring that up, and I think that's something we have to watch in the future. I had previously covered this, and this is what is expected. I think they are expecting the West to cover about half of that, and the U.S. to cover about half of that, then the rest of the West with the IMF and things covering the other half. So likely, more than half will be covered by the United States. Also on November 3rd, we had a couple U.S. senators, bipartisan junket visiting Kiev. So this was Senators Rod Portman and Chris Coons. Portman's a Republican from Ohio. Coons is a Democrat from Delaware, Joe Biden's home state. They visited Kiev on Thursday and pledged that there will be bipartisan support for providing massive amounts of aid after the upcoming midterm elections. I am confident that the robust American support for the fight of the Ukrainian people will continue in Congress, Coons said. Now, I want to take a second here and just talk about the midterm election. I do not think in any way there may be like one or two ballots, one or two races you could find candidates with legitimately different views on the war in Ukraine, but almost every single person running is just running as a hawk on this. And so, while, Republican Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy said that a Republican-controlled House won't write a blank check for Ukraine, he's basically just saying that the Republicans want some oversight over what the Democratic White House is going to do. This shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone. Now, so I don't think that there will be any real change to U.S. policy coming after the midterm elections from the Congress. Now, what happens in the White House? Like, I don't know. Maybe the White House really believe that the only thing they have going for them right now is this war and the abortion issue. And so they really have to plug the two of them, and they can't waver at all. But maybe Biden thinks he'll have a little bit more room to negotiate. Maybe he could stand a little bit tougher to Zelensky after the midterm election. I'm not sure. I'm just saying I think that's a possible calculation that the White House is making, knowing just how American politicians think about things in a general sense, particularly Democrats. They don't want to look weak, especially before an election. So maybe we'll see something different, but I don't think the war in Ukraine is at all on the ballot in America in the upcoming elections. And likely what we're going to see is just more of the same from the Republican Congress. We're already getting a little bit more oversight of the weapons, so they might step that up a little bit, but that's about all I would expect. All right, next article. White House will send taints drones to Ukraine, and I wrote this for antiwar.com on November 4th. The Biden administration approved the 25th round of security assistance for Ukraine on Friday. The latest weapons package will include upgraded taints and drones. Kiev requested more armored vehicles to push its offensive against Russian forces. A Pentagon press release said it had purchased 45 refurbished T-72B taints with advanced optics communications and armor. The Department of Defense claims the Netherlands will provide an additional 45 taints, and the Czech Republic will provide additional support by completing the upgrades. So I believe these are taints that were owned by the Czech Republic. The U.S. bought 45, the Netherlands bought 45, and they bought the upgrades. Maybe the Czech Republic gave, some deals on it. I have no idea, what really the cost of all this was. They say the total weapons package is $400 million, but we'll get into there's quite a bit of other stuff in that too. And this is a really unique weapons package as far as I could tell, so it'll be a little bit more to break down here as far as the numbers go. But these upgrade taints are interesting. Now, the Czech Republic and one other NATO state has already sent the 72Bs to Ukraine, and these are models that they're Soviet-era weapons that the Ukrainian army already used. Ukraine has been seeking upgraded NATO edition taints, and these didn't get transferred, but depending on how refurbished these taints are and how advanced the equipment is, they could be some pretty serious upgrades and maybe far more capable. Back to my article. Since the start of the war, Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, has requested NATO members send their taints to Ukraine. In separate appeals, Kiev asked NATO for transfers of 1% of their taints, and for Western countries to give Ukraine 500 taints. I think 1% would be far more taints than the 500 taints. And 500 is probably a more realistic ask, but it was still too much. Washington and its partners have not filled Zelensky's request. In September, the Washington Post reported that Kiev believed it was reaching the tipping point and more armored vehicles could help complete its victory. Kiev believes the requested heavy armor, including battle tanks and personnel carriers, could help shift that tipping point into our turning point into a tipping point, the Washington Post reported. Germany rebuffed Ukraine when asked directly for tanks. No country has delivered Western-built infantry fighting vehicles or main battle tanks so far. We have agreed with our partners that Germany will not take such an action unilaterally, the German defense minister said. The upgraded T-72 taints the U.S. and Netherlands are buying for Kiev are not NATO models but Soviet-era weapons. Poland and the Czech Republic had already sent Ukraine hundreds of these taints. Still, Zelensky believed that the taints will be effective in Kiev's offensive. He tweeted on Friday, "I am thankful to Joe Biden and the people of the U.S. for another $400 million in military assistance package for armored vehicles that will help us to liberate Ukrainian land. We appreciate the continued support," he tweeted with an exclamation point. In addition to the taints, the 25th package includes 1,100 Phoenix Ghost tactical unmanned aerial systems, 40 armored ravine boats, tactical secure communication systems, and surveillance systems. Though that's not the only thing in the $400 million package. This package is a little bit different than previous ones, and it's paid for through the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative. Most of the arms the Biden administration has provided Kiev have been authorized through the Presidential Drawdown Authority. Under the PDA, the president can send a foreign army weapons from Americans' own stockpiles. In contrast, the USAI uses funds to buy weapons for Kiev directly from companies or foreign governments. The latest package also includes funding to send Ukraine weapons in the future. Some funds will be used to upgrade Hawk air defense missiles from American stockpiles before shipping them to Ukraine. The Pentagon also said it would upgrade and transfer 250 M1117A armored security vehicles to Kiev. And so just to I think make the most, get into this in the most nuance and detail possible. I think what they're doing is they're using the PDA and the USAI. I think they're using the PDA. They're going to transfer the Hawk missiles. They're going to transfer these Pentagon-owned armored personnel carriers, but they're going to upgrade them before, and they're going to take the funds from the USAI to upgrade them, but they're transferring the weapons from the PDA. And so I think this is going to really complicate the budget sheets here. And so while the Department of Defense is putting the number at over 18 billion in weapons it sent Ukraine since Russia invaded in February, the Kiel Institute is putting that number at nearly 28 billion, and that was actually only through October 3rd. That's over a month ago now, and I think we're probably should be at about 30 billion if we look at the near weekly arms transfers that we've had approved. And even though these past couple have been smaller, it does add up. The past 2 weeks alone, it sits under $50 million. And of course, this one, I think some of the importance not just comes from the fact that it's another $400 million for the war effort, but the U.S. sending these upgraded taints, while maybe not a new weapon system for the Ukrainian army, is certainly a step up in the amount of support that the U.S. is giving Ukraine's military. Next up, Dave DeCamp from November 1st. After over 8 months of pouring arms into Ukraine, U.S. announces some oversight. And Dave writes here, the State Department announced the plan on October 27th that focused on keeping powerful portable weapons like Javelin anti-tank missiles and Stinger anti-aircraft missiles off the black market. Responsible statecraft reported that the exports are warning the plan has gaps and doesn't address the issue of smaller arms. And so Javelin, and Stingers are fairly long. These aren't things that you could put under your shirt and walk out the door with or anything like that. And so they are sending a lot of small arms to Ukraine too. So this doesn't solve all the problems, and I'm sure maybe some of the lack of oversight could even be intentional at times, and that this won't be 100% foolproof, but it's good to see that they're at least expressing some interest in oversight here. The State Department said in order to achieve its oversight goals, the U.S. will bolster the ability of Ukraine and other regional countries to account for and safeguard their arms and ammunition, strengthen borders, and bolster security agencies to deter and direct and indirect illicit trafficking of certain advanced conventional weapons. Another aspect of this effort is in-person inspections of U.S. weapons inside Ukraine that are being conducted by the U.S. military. The Pentagon revealed on Monday that its personnel have begun conducting these inspections inside the country, marking the first official confirmation of a U.S. military presence on the ground inside of Ukraine since Russia invaded on February 24th. And I've already talked about the U.S. personnel being on the ground, so I don't want to get into that too much, but allowing like Ukraine to have oversight over this, I think essentially makes all that oversight worthless, because you would have to trust your Ukrainian counterparts aren't going to do anything illicit, which I'm guessing is happening quite a lot in Ukraine. The Pentagon did not provide much detail on where the inspections are taking place, but said they are being conducted by personnel based at the U.S. Embassy in Kiev. Brigadier General Patrick Ryder told reporters on Tuesday that there are U.S. Marines at the embassy conducting guard duties on top of the weapons inspectors. Ryder also said that the inspectors will not be near the front lines. According to U.S. media reports, U.S. Special Operator Forces and CIA operators are also on the ground in Ukraine, but the covert operations have not been officially confirmed by Washington. President Biden has repeatedly said he wouldn't send troops to Ukraine, which he said before the Russia invasion could spark a world war. So I don't think I really have anything else to add here. Dave does a pretty good job writing and covering all the things that need to be covered in his article. Next up, this one from Connor Freeman, the co-host. He wrote this for antiwar.com on Friday. Pentagon vows to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. Launches new command. The Pentagon announced that it was setting up a new command based in Germany to oversee the training and equipping of Ukrainian military during its fight with Russia. The New York Times reported on Friday the command is named Security Assistance Group-Ukraine, or SAG-U. The news came soon after the announcement of another $400 million arms package that includes tanks and drones, and I already went over what's in that arms package. Kind of writes, current and former U.S. officials told the Times these moves suggest that Washington expects the threat from Russia to Ukraine and its neighbors to persist for many years. Sabrina Singh, the deputy Pentagon press secretary, told reporters that the new command will ensure we are postured to continue supporting Ukraine over the long term. She added the U.S. remains committed to Ukraine for as long as it takes. Discussions about formal command to oversee operations in Ukraine began earlier this year. SAG-U will be led by a high-ranking general with roughly 300 personnel and staff, so that's quite a substantial, command, especially since I'm guessing these will mostly be officers, conducting training. These aren't people like that would necessarily be deployed to Ukraine, I think, even to fight. They're more trainers and things like that. A possible reason for this decision may be to obscure the level of funding going to the proxy war, making it difficult for Americans and journalists to discern where the money comes from and how much is being spent. As Kelly Vlahos, editorial director at Responsible Statecraft, has written, Dan Cladwell, senior advisor to Concerned Americans for America, suggests this could allow the Pentagon to carve out a protective fund for the war, establishing a formal named mission or military task force specifically for Ukraine could further open the door for moving funding for the war in Ukraine to overseas contingency operations budget, which is essentially the Pentagon slush fund. That could be one of the primary motivations here. The Pentagon wants a steady stream of funding from a source that Congress has shown a willingness to properly oversee. Officially, since the war began, the Pentagon has authorized nearly $19 billion in direct military aid for Ukraine, though data from the Kiel Institute suggests that the figure is higher. Connor wraps up here writing, members of both parties in Congress are reportedly planning another massive aid package for Ukraine that is said to cost at least $50 billion, which brings the total spending on the war to about $115 billion. This is just crazy. All right. So couple more stories here on the war in Ukraine. Talking about Kelly Vallejos, Connor cites her in his article. She wrote this article for the Quincy Institute on November 1st. U.S. trained Afghan commandos join Russian campaign in Ukraine. According to two key reports by Foreign Policy and the Associated Press this week, Afghan commandos trained by the United States military during our war there are going to Ukraine to fight on behalf of the Russians for $1,500 a month. They don't want to go fight, but they don't have a choice, one former Afghan general who spoke to the AP, emphasizing the fear the commandos have of being deported back to Afghanistan. They asked me, give me a solution. What should we do? If we go back to Afghanistan, the Taliban will kill us. So this is where the U.S. war in Afghan, the withdrawal, and Washington's failure to keep these men and their families safe from the Taliban. Vengeance has let them fighting for Russia, the former Afghan enemy in the Soviet Union, in Ukraine, 3,000 miles away. While there are tens of thousands of special immigrant visa holder applicants, translators, and others who worked closely with the United States State Department or military over a 20-year span still waiting to leave Afghanistan, the soldiers headed to Ukraine are among the 20 to 30 Afghan commandos who work with U.S. forces but do not qualify for a official ticket from the country because they did not technically work for the U.S. They were employees of the Afghan government. So, this is just all the U.S. meddling around the world has created this. Next article from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Russia considers further steps over allegations that the UK was behind Nord Stream blast. The Kremlin on Tuesday said Russia was considering further steps to take in response to British alleged role in the attacks on the Nord Stream natural gas pipelines, which connect Russia to Germany. Such actions cannot be put aside. Of course, we will think about further steps. It definitely cannot be left like this, the Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said. On Saturday, Russia's defense ministry accused British naval specialists of involvement in the attacks on Nord Stream pipelines, which resulted in what was likely the largest ever methane release. London has denied the Russian accusation. Now, certainly somebody did blow up this pipeline, right? This wasn't just like some random act. I think we're pretty clear on that at this point. One pipeline rupturing, maybe that gets bent into some kind of false flag, but I really don't think that's what happened here. So, questions, and I've made it clear on the show that I didn't really see an indication or evidence that the White House was behind this, and just given the White House's policies, I thought it would be really unlikely for them to be behind such a large release of methane, since climate change is such a central part of their policy. So I speculated that maybe the UK would be maybe the most likely. Other people talked about Poland and maybe Denmark, some of these other European countries. Russia blaming the UK seems like it might be a more on the mark accusation, but I haven't seen any evidence to really suggest it at this point. So, that's really all I have on that. My guess is Russia is going to continue to retaliate and carry out different kinds of responses for that attack, though. But Putin says necessary conditions may arise for peace talks, so this seems like some good news. On Monday, Russian President Vladimir Putin said that the necessary conditions for peace talks with Ukraine could arise and acknowledged that Kiev was not ready for negotiations at this time. We have reached an agreement with them in Istanbul, but they've thrown all that into the bin, Putin said at a press conference in Sochi, according to Newsweek, referring to the peace talks that were held in Istanbul at the end of March. And now they're refusing to discuss anything with us. In response to Russia's annexation of the territory it controls in Ukraine, Ukrainian President Zelensky signed a decree ruling out peace talks with Russia as long as Putin is president. The U.S. has ruled out the idea of pushing Ukraine to the negotiating table and says it's up to Zelensky when talks will begin. Putin said Russia is willing to wait as long as talks can happen. How how can we talk about the possible agreements if the other side has no desire to even talk with us? Well, we can't wait, he said. Maybe some necessary conditions will eventually arise. We have made our goodwill known. And so, look, Putin's overstating it with goodwill and everything like that. But I do think it's some positive news that, there could be a potential diplomatic settlement to this war sometime. That the Kremlin is keeping that open. I do think it is positive. U.S. says no indication Russia is preparing to use a nuclear weapon. Again, more good news. This from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. The Biden administration said Wednesday that it sees no indication Russia is preparing to use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine after media reports claimed Ukrainian officials were discussing the matter. We continue to monitor this the best we can, and we see no indication that Russia is making preparations for such use, White House National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby told reporters. Citing unnamed U.S. officials, the New York Times reported that senior Russian officials recently discussed when and how to use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine. The report isn't confirmed, and Kirby declined to comment on the specifics. Responding to the report, the Kremlin spokesperson Peskov said Western media is deliberately pumping up the topic of the use of nuclear weapons. He says the Times is very irresponsible. If the report is true, it is typical of officials in nuclear-armed states to discuss the potential use of nuclear weapons and even rehearse dropping them, as NATO and Russia recently did during their annual nuclear war games. Russian President Vladimir Putin said last week that he has no plans of using nuclear weapons in Ukraine. We see no need for that. There is no point in that, neither political nor military. Putin has previously warned that Russia could use all weapons at its disposal to defend its territorial integrity, and other Russian officials have made it clear that included nuclear weapons and applied to the territories Moscow recently annexed in Ukraine. Russian officials insist that Putin's warning fell within Moscow's military doctrine, which says it can use a nuclear weapon in the face of existential threats. So, this being the White House's position, I do think is good news. Again, I do think these past two stories are a little bit good news, even if you have to look at it through some nuance and but if the White House was saying that they were concerned about Russia using a nuclear weapon, that's when I think the time would be more concerned. But that does seem like good that they're downplaying that. Last story. Oh, no, it's not. Turkey says Finland, Sweden have not done enough to join NATO. And I wrote this for the Libertarian Institute on November 3rd. The Turkish foreign minister indicated Ankara is unlikely to approve Finland and Sweden's NATO membership bids anytime soon. Turkey and Hungary are the only two North Atlantic Treaty Organization members that have not consented to the Nordic states' ascension into the alliance. During a press conference with NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, the foreign minister said both countries are expressing that they are committed to the memorandum, but what matters is execution, adding, right now we cannot say those commitments have been lived up to by those countries. Stoltenberg disagreed with the foreign minister, insisting that Sweden and Finland have delivered. It's time to welcome Finland and Sweden as members of NATO. No, that was from Stoltenberg. During a NATO summit last June, Ankara, Stockholm, and Helsinki reached a trilateral agreement under which Turkey would allow the two Nordic states to join the alliance. To become a NATO member, a country must have the approval of all other alliance members. Finland and Sweden's disagreements with Turkey mainly stem from Ankara's repression of its Kurdish minority population and Helsinki and Stockholm's support for Kurdish groups. One plank in the trilateral agreement required the two NATO hopefuls to lift an arms embargo against Turkey. Helsinki and Stockholm have both taken that step. Still, Ankara is demanding they leave up to the full agreement, which requires the extradition of several Kurds to Turkey. The foreign minister said most of the delays have been caused by Sweden, but Helsinki's NATO application is tied to Stockholm's bid. Turkey says it won't give approval until both states are living up to the agreement. The Kremlin has said it does not object to Finland and Sweden joining the North Atlantic Alliance. However, Moscow threatened to deploy more weapons to the Baltic region if either country had stepped its stationing of strategic weapons in their territory. Last week, a Finnish newspaper reported that Helsinki might allow the deployment of nuclear weapons if Finland is accepted into NATO, and both officials from both states recently said they would not rule out such a move. So I want to wrap up here with two more stories, one on the situation with China, and then the last one on the situation with Korea. All right, the article on China is from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. China's foreign minister says South China Sea claimants should jointly resist the U.S. Chinese foreign minister Yang Yi has called on other claimants to the South China Sea to jointly resist U.S. pressure in the region, the South China Morning Post reported on Thursday. China, Taiwan, the Philippines, Vietnam, Brunei, and Malaysia all have overlapping claims in the South China Sea. The U.S. has inserted itself into the maritime dispute and formally rejected most of Beijing's claims in 2020, which have been reaffirmed by the Biden administration. I guess it seems unlikely that these countries are going to do that because, the U.S. intervention in the region bolsters their claims because Beijing is the superpower, right? So that they could claim more and try to get more because they have the backing of the U.S. nuclear arsenal or could. So, I don't think it's going to be listened to, but interesting story. The last article I have today, U.S. to station more nuclear-capable assets on Korean Peninsula, I wrote for antiwar.com on Friday. The White House has authorized employing strategic assets in South Korea more frequently. The announcement comes as Pyongyang, Seoul, and Washington conduct unprecedented aerial war games. At a news conference with Secretary of State Lloyd Austin and South Korean Defense Minister Lee Yong-sup, Lee stated Austin pledged to set up deployments of nuclear-capable weapons. He said the U.S. promised to effectively respond to any DPRK provocation by employing U.S. strategic assets to the level equivalent to constant deployment through increasing the frequency and intensity of strategic deployment in and around the Korean Peninsula. And strategic is, a weapon that is capable of carrying a nuclear weapon. Austin expressed the deployments would not be permanent, but rotate in and out. No new deployments of strategic assets on a permanent basis, but you will see the assets move in and out on a routine basis. Now, this might actually cause more problems, and let me explain why. If the U.S. were to deploy, let's say, some nuclear-capable bombers or something on or around the Korean Peninsula, nuclear-capable missiles, nuclear-capable submarine, and said, it's always there, then North Korea is going to have a massive reaction when that deployment happens, but it's not going to, be every other month. Now we're moving in these bombers. Now we're moving in this ship. Now we're moving in these missiles. Now the bombers are back. Now the ship's back. Now we have all three here. These are the kinds of things that are going to happen, and it's going to be continuous provocations towards North Korea, which is going to cause North Korea to fire weapons and carry out their own things, and then the U.S. and Seoul are going to say, oh my goodness, we had to respond to Pyongyang, so now we have to do more. And so the way they're setting it up guarantees escalations well into the future. Austin stated the strategic appointments would extend beyond the Korean Peninsula. What we're doing together, not only but on a bilateral basis, but with our allies in Japan. Austin said Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo signed a trilateral defense agreement on the sidelines of the NATO summit in June. Pyongyang denounced the agreement as a NATO-like alliance in the Pacific. The news conference came after the U.S. and South Korea announced it was extending their largest ever aerial war games. The military drills, dubbed Vigilant Storm 23, include 240 U.S. and South Korean aircraft, also a Australian refueling tanker. Initially, the exercises were scheduled to run for 5 days, but have now been extended by a day, and I believe they should be wrapped up as of this recording, but I haven't been able to confirm that yet, that for whatever reason they didn't extended on the low key or something. Before Vigilant Storm 23 kicked off, North Korean Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un slammed the drills as a rehearsal for invasion and promised a powerful response if Seoul and Washington went through with the exercises. On Wednesday, Pyongyang fired 23 short-range missiles, a single-day record. One missile was fired near the maritime border between the Koreas for the first time since partition. South Korea responded by firing 3 air-to-surface missiles into the waters north of the inter-Korean border. North Korea followed the flurry of missile tests by launching an intercontinental ballistic missile on Thursday. Seoul believes the ICBM failed in flight. On Friday, North Korea carried out large-scale aerial maneuvers. South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff reported that 180 North Korean warplanes were detected in various areas along the country's eastern and western coasts. Seoul noted that the warplanes did not approach the inter-Korean border. In response, South Korea scrambled 80 warplanes, including F-35s. The South Korean Joint Chiefs of Staff said that it was maintaining a firm readiness posture for other provocations. Military activity on the Korean Peninsula is at a multi-year high. Pyongyang has carried out a record number of missile tests this year. Washington and Seoul have returned to live-fire war games. A diplomatic solution currently seems impossible. Austin and Lee reiterated Washington and Seoul's position that Pyongyang must agree to give up its nuclear arsenal. Kim signed a new law in September that says North Korea will not denuclearize until the U.S. does. Kim views his nuclear weapons as the only effective deterrent against Washington-based regime change. The White House says it seeks a nuclear-free Korean peninsula. However, Austin threatened to use nuclear weapons against North Korea at the press conference. Last week, Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman said Washington was prepared to deploy its nuclear weapons to defend South Korea. And so obviously North Korea is not going to give up its nuclear weapons with the U.S. threatening to nuke it. All right, guys, that's where I'm wrapping up the show for today. Thank you all so much for continuing to listen to the show, sharing the show, and doing all that great stuff, and buying your CBD with Paloma Verde. Just remember, the promo code is PEACE.